In this day and age, we're very suspicious of governmental authority. But here's what Paul says. Romans 13:1. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. I can hear people moan and groan at this one. Lots of objections. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you, for he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. Point A. Let every soul, every person be subject to governing authorities. Since all authorities are appointed over men by God alone, then whoever resists authority resists the ordinance, the authority of God himself, and brings God's judgment upon himself. Let's look at 12:1 and 2. Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and pleasing and perfect will. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Romans 12:1 and 2 command believers to offer their bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, and to not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of the mind. Then they will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and pleasing and perfect will. So the believer is to be transformed by the conforming of his conscience to the will of God through a study, acceptance, and application to his life of the words of God's word, which explain his will. Peculiar, because this rolls right into chapter 3. Romans 12:3 through 15:13, which follow, stipulate specific things to obey in order to achieve that transformation. Okay, now I get it. So the command in Romans 13:1, rendered in the King James Version, New King James, let every soul, every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God, implies that it is God's will that believers and every individual must be subject in deed and conscience to the governing authorities that God has placed them under. This implies compliance not only in deed, but with a godly conscience from which those deeds originate. Note that Romans 13:1 gives special emphasis to the fact that all rulers are established solely by the Lord. Since all governing authorities are established by God alone and for his holy purposes, in other words, there is no one else who establishes ruling authority in the universe except God. And since it is evident from history that some ruling authorities have been more disciplinary than others, even cruel and ungodly, and since individuals are treated by God in accordance with their faithfulness, then the manner in which individuals are treated by their ruling authorities is directly related to their faith and faithfulness to God. Exceptions noted, believers under testing and martyrdom. So, whoever resists governmental authority, even if only in conscience, resists the ordinance, the authority of God himself, and brings God's judgment upon himself, which judgment is often wielded by that government. On the other hand, since God establishes all ruling authority, then all ruling authority is responsible to represent his will. When it does not, that authority will suffer the consequences. Hence, the evil behavior of rulers is in no way condoned by the Lord. So point B, individuals who do right by submitting to the authority of their rulers with a godly conscience, free from a mental attitude of rebelliousness, are placed, 1, under the Lord's protection, and 2, are in a position to be free from fearing those in authority, and 3, will be commended by them. We can keep reading and find out what about the evil that these governments do. Rulers hold no terror for submissive individuals, but for those who do evil by resisting their authority. Since rulers are God's servants who bear the sword as avengers to execute God's wrath on those who practice evil, then one must be subject to one's rulers not only because of the potential of God's wrath, but also because of the conscience God has provided within them. Peculiar. Now let's go back and take a look at some of these verses again. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong, according to them. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. For he is God's minister, literally servant, to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, literally servant, and avenger, to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Wherefore, it is necessary to be subject not only because of the wrath, but also because of the conscience. The Greek phrase for Romans 13:3a, noted above and rendered, for rulers hold no terror for those who do right, in the NIV, has in view those who do right, in other words, those who submit to governmental authority with a godly conscience, free from a mental attitude of rebelliousness, who are consequently described as those for whom rulers hold no terror, no traumatizing fear of losing their authority or forced from their position of authority. Those who exemplify such submissiveness to authority are stipulated as doing right, literally good, as opposed to those who do wrong, literally evils. The latter referring to those who resist governmental authority, even if only in their attitude or conscience. Those who do right avoid the consequent temporal judgment of God stipulated in verse 13:2. Then a question is posed in 13:3b. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? And the answer, then do what is right, literally good, for he, the ruler, will commend you. This implies that if the believer submits himself to his governing authorities and does not rebel against them in conscience or deed, he will be doing right in the sight of God and should be free from fear of the ones in authority over him. Furthermore, it suggests that God will enable the believer who submits to governmental or ruling authority to be protected and commended by his rulers. The BKC, Bible Knowledge Commentary, explained it this way, 13:1-3. Paul discussed to Christians' relationship to his government and civil rulers. The apostle's basic exhortation is, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, higher authorities. The basic reason for such submission is that those authorities are established by God. An individual who rebels against the authority, therefore, is rebelling against, literally has taken a stand against what God has instituted, the ordinance of God. Such persons are those thus actually rebelling against God and bring civil and or divine judgment on themselves. Those who obey and do what right need have no fear of authorities. In fact, civil authorities or individuals or leaders commend those who do good. Believers are endowed by God with a conscience, a conscious understanding and mental impetus to choose to obey God, to consciously acknowledge and submit to the Lord's designated governmental authority over them. Romans 13:4, for he is God's minister, literally servant, to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Wherefore it is necessary to be subject, not only because of the wrath, but also because of the conscience. So Romans 13:4 indicates that a governmental ruling authority is God's servant to do the believer good, when the believer submits to it with a godly conscience free from a mental attitude of rebelliousness. Thus, the believer is to trust in God to deliver him from fear and harm, as he is faithful to God's command to be subject to his governing authorities in godly conscience and deed. Now, you have to have godly conscience. So if the ruling authority asks you to do murder or some violent thing or some ungodly thing, that's the question. Let's see how it's answered. So, subject to his governing authorities in godly conscience and deed. Hence, the believer is not to fear punishment from the ruler when he is submissive. On the other hand, the believer, or any subject under authority, does wrong by evidencing rebellion to the ruler in conscience and or deed. He should be afraid, for the ruler of God's servant bears the sword by God's design, in the sense of having the armed capacity and authority to exact physical punishment, even death, upon a rebellious subject, in order to bring God's wrathful punishment on the wrongdoer. Verse 13:5 of Romans then corroborates that it is necessary to submit to authorities not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. This implies that believers are endowed by God with a conscience, a conscious understanding and mental impetus to choose to conform to God's command to consciously acknowledge and submit to the Lord's designated governmental authority over them. If they trust in and are faithful to him, then they will be protected from harm and even commended by that ruler. So one must submit to himself to governmental authority in actions and in conformance with one's conscience, i.e. with a godly conscience, an action backed up by a godly attitude of submission. Hence, one must not have a mental attitude of resisting governmental authority while submitting to one's rulers. Otherwise, one is still resisting governmental authority and liable to receive the wrath of God. One is to maintain a godly conscience toward God relative to constantly acknowledging and submitting to one's governmental authorities with the understanding that they have been appointed over one by God as his servants to do his will. Point D, people receive from God the kind of government that they deserve. Okay, that answers the question. That reflects their character. That mirrors their response to their God-given conscience. In order to be blessed by God with a godly ruling authority, the people's actions and responses to their consciences must largely be godly and free from reflecting an unwillingness to submit to governmental rulers, even when the rulers are evil, inept, or corrupt. So let's keep reading, see if we can get some answers. Since ruling authorities are appointed by God, Romans 13:2, and since the character of ruling authorities varies from godly to ungodly, mostly the latter, largely reflecting the people they rule, then groups of people forming rulerships, villages, cities, states, nations, and so on, receive from God the kind of government that they deserve. That mirrors their character, that reflects their response to their God-given consciences. Hence, a people who exemplify a pattern of ungodliness will eventually receive an ungodly ruler, sending them in the direction of self-destruction. This implies that the character of ruling authorities, being under God's sovereign control, will be changed to reflect the character of its people. So in order to be blessed by God with a godly ruling authority, the people's actions and responses to their God-given consciences must largely be godly and free from reflecting an unwillingness to submit to government rulers, even when the rulers are evil, inept, or corrupt, which is